Killers of the Flower Moon is a deeply personal, tragic story that holds major family ties to many of its cast members. At its core, it's a heartbreaking story of Indigenous people told through a lens of impressive improvisation, personal ties with the Osage Nation, and painful, unresolved family tragedies that still haunts one of the actors to this day. Although the screenplay for this movie was strategically and carefully crafted, there was still a little room for improv. This was also an aspect that Cara Jade Myers, who plays Anna Kyle Brown, really loved in regarding her performance, though the scene itself is rather heartbreaking. It was the scene where she and her sisters Molly, Minnie, and Rita were at a picnic, talking about the white men and how, although they were obviously shady and trying to steal their money, they couldn't help but find them attractive. That whole scene was improvised. She said even though the scene itself is happy, if you know the ending, it's much more sinister. These women were genuinely trusting and loving, and they expected their husbands to take care of them and protect them. I briefly mentioned earlier that this movie has many personal ties to the cast. One in particular being Yancey Red Corn, who plays Principal Chief Bonnie Castle. He pulled from his experiences observing his late father Charles Red Corn and his uncle negotiate with members of Congress on behalf of the Osage Nation. Something very bittersweet about this movie for him was that it opened with a scene from his father's book, A Pipe for February. He said that his father was never an outwardly emotional man, but he knows that he would have been floored over that. Yancey Red Corn couldn't help but get swept up into the stories of all the real-life people involved in this tragedy. Let's talk about Red Corn's great-grandfather. Yancey Red Corn's deeply personal connection to Killers of the Flower Moon doesn't stop with his late father, but goes all the way back to his great-grandfather, Raymond Red Corn Sr., who was poisoned, and his case to this day remains unsolved. The whole system at the time was heinously corrupt, and it made it pretty much impossible to find out who was behind it. Everyone from the neighbors, local pastors, morticians, doctors, police, and the government are all included in that statement, so it's like, who was there to go to? The case still haunts Red Corn's family to this day. If it weren't for narratives and projects like this, the majority of people would have no idea about these tragedies that have so deeply affected people's lives for generations. They are hoping by bringing these stories to life that it can help others cope with the loss of their loved ones. The red carpet seems like it can definitely be an anxiety-inducing experience, especially being an Indigenous actor telling a story that a lot of people in power don't want to be shared. All three Indigenous actors were completely overwhelmed in the most positive way to be surrounded by their Indigenous peers while walking the red carpet. They're hoping this film can encourage conversation about Native history and the major issue of the many Indigenous people who have gone missing without a trace or inquisition. Unfortunately, stories like this are extremely difficult to get out there, especially in places like Oklahoma, where they have a ban on critical race theory. Cara Jade Myers is deeply motivated to get this story out to the public. People didn't care about natives back then. Like the line in the movie, "You're more likely to go to jail for kicking a dog." If you know the rest of that line, you'll know how gut-wrenching it is for these actors to talk about. So Leonardo DiCaprio, I'm sure you've heard of him, told the costume designer of the film, Jacqueline West, that he thinks they worked on a masterpiece. That's not something he usually says, considering he's been working in Hollywood since his childhood, so that statement isn't to be taken lightly. Leonardo has been talking up this film since 2019, describing it as one epic master orchestra led by Scorsese. He's been heavily invested, with no signs of letting up on getting this story told. He co-produced the film and took on the role of Ernest Burkhart, whose loyalties are conflicted with his family and his personal ambition. I'm not shocked by this at all, but due to the deeply emotional story backed by such an impressive cast, critics are saying that Killers of the Flower Moon is going to be a major player come Oscar season. Due to the fact that these characters are based on real people throughout history, it gives the film that deep-rooted personal edge that audiences can't help but be drawn into. It's expected to be nominated for Best Picture, Best Director for Scorsese, Best Adapted Screenplay for Scorsese and Eric Roth, Best Actor for DiCaprio, Best Supporting Actor for De Niro, and Best Supporting Actress for Gladstone. This will be Leo's 6th Oscar bid that will put him at the same level as two cinema icons, Richard Burton and Daniel Day-Lewis. It's also pretty crazy to think about how this could have been a completely different story. I'm not gonna leave you hanging there. Let's talk about it. Leonardo DiCaprio was originally cast as Tom White, a Texas Ranger turned FBI agent that got sent to Oklahoma after receiving a harrowing phone call from the Osage Nation. The original script had all the makings of a classic Western, or murder mystery. They didn't want it to be told as some white savior movie, considering who the actual bad guys were. So instead, they decided to focus on the relationship between Bill and Ernest. Robert De Niro explains the thought process behind that decision in an interview with Deadline. They wanted to focus more on that dynamic instead of Tom White coming in and saving the day. That shift created the much more personal story that we have today. The decision to cast Robert De Niro as Leonardo DiCaprio's uncle was one of the best things that could have been done for this movie, as it ends up playing into their real-life father-son relationship dynamic that has developed between them over time. Leonardo says his career was launched by doing This Boy's Life, where he first met and auditioned with Robert De Niro. Working with him, watching his professionalism and the way he created his character was one of the most influential experiences of my life and career. Coincidentally, Leo also ended up doing a ton of films with Martin Scorsese, but they didn't end up coming full circle until 30 years later, where they all ended up working on this project together. Robert De Niro is apparently a man of few words, but according to Martin Scorsese, he was impressed with Leo from the very beginning. He said, "I'm working with this young boy. You must work with him sometime." That was the first time I heard him recommend somebody to me. The kid is really good. All three of them ending up on this project together was a surreal experience for Leo, to say the least. Something else Martin Scorsese has to say about Leo is that throughout all the years he's worked with him, the reason why he's always so impressed is that the guy can just go there. He goes to these really weird places that are so difficult and convoluted, and through the convolution, somehow there's a clarity that we reach. He says there's just something about the subtle movements of his face and the way his eyes look that really bring the scene to life. It's almost unexplainable, apparently. There's something in his face that the camera looks into, in his eyes. The slightest movement, we know it. He said he could just film Leo basically just chilling out, not thinking about anything in particular, and it could be taken to a context completely out of this world. The guy just goes the extra mile in every aspect. I mean, do I have to bring up The Revenant right now, or... No, you get it. Let's talk about his character Ernest, that was honestly barely in the book at all. There was a lot of back and forth between Leo and Martin landing on the role of Ernest. It was a bit of shock to Martin when the topic came up because there really wasn't a lot written about him, narratively. Martin reflects on the conversation with Leo that brought the character to life. He is the weakling, a man who is in love with his wife, but he's poisoning her. He was like, yeah, okay, how are we gonna do that? Leo really wanted to go into uncharted territory with the film's characters. So they did. It's almost unclear whether Ernest is ignorant or in denial of what he was doing to his wife, but every scene was carefully constructed, even some up until the day of the shoot. It was days rather, of work. They pretty much lived on set day and night, even through the weekends. It's no shock though, as the film runs at about 3.5 hours. Originally, when Leo ended up changing his role, Paramount stepped out as the principal financier. And with a runtime as long as this movie, it created a lot of pressure for Martin. There was a lot of talk about the runtime, and it was too much for the theater. But it ended up being unavoidable due to the nature of the film. The risk is there, showing in a theater in the first place, but the risk for this subject matter and then for running time, it's a commitment. Martin says that spending 4 hours in the theater for this film will, without a doubt, enrich the audience's life. Spending the evening or the afternoon with this picture, with this story, with these people, with this world that reflects on the world we are in today, more so than we might realize. He believes that it is a concentrated effort for audiences to nurture an appreciation for films like these, especially ones that are meant to be seen in the theater. But it's films and risks like these that make this career worth it for everyone involved. The cast of Killers of the Flower Moon didn't hold anything back. Everyone on this film worked tirelessly, night and day, to tell the complex, gut-wrenching story of a nation of Indigenous people whose voices didn't get to see the light of day. This film, full of deep emotion rooted in historical trauma, could only be told by an ensemble of people willing to take a risk. How many Oscar nominations do you predict?